Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Nearly 90% of Australian business leaders expect risk and security issues to get worse in the next 12 months. It's the alarming headline of the new Risk and Security Report from McGrath-Nicol Advisory, building on last year's findings. The report explores exactly what local business leaders think about risks, including geopolitical threats, insider risk, cybersecurity, and more. I'm joined today by McGrath-Nicol partner and head of advisory, Matt Feehan AM. Morning, Matt.
Good morning, Sean.
Also, we've got Sarah Deedy, partner forensic at McGrath-Nicol. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning, Sean.
McGrath-Nicol's a great supporter of this podcast. Matt, Sarah, start with you, Matt. Talk us through some of the headline results. I mentioned 89%, or I said 90%, but it was not 89% of executives expect risk and security issues to worsen in severity over the next year. That's up significantly since last year. I think it was about 58% last year. How has the business risk landscape changed in the past 12 months?
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for the opportunity to share the results of the survey. I will say at the outset, the survey we conducted with YouGov, the survey that they facilitated contacted over 300 board members or senior executives of organisations that have over 50 plus employees. But the fact that what you've highlighted there around risk and security issues worsening, I think only goes to reflect the growing concern around the geopolitical environment. Last year, our survey touched on, and one of the more revealing issues for me from a cyber attack perspective was 91% of organisations the year before said that they would think worse of a supplier or counterparty should they have a cyber attack. Last year, that reduced down to 68%. So that's telling me that people are expecting more cyber attacks to occur, either upon them or within their supply chain. And that's now being reflected in risk and security concerns. And as we say, the various geopolitical perceptions that business leaders are experiencing or expecting to see.
In a sense, what you just said then, perhaps it's a bit worrying that people think less of third parties if they have a cyber risk, but it also suggests that it's become the norm, Matt, or people expect it now.
It is expected, and I think what is expected, both from an emerging regulatory perspective, but also counterparties, they're expecting organisations to do a lot more within their supply chain, and in particular, I think they're now expecting organisations to understand where the risks may lay within this supply chain, doing proper due diligence on counterparty or suppliers' cyber risk frameworks and understanding how they're positioned. Like, I think more than 3/4 of the respondents said in this survey that they don't have mandatory requirements by their suppliers to report to them if they have a data or cyber breach. And that could be their critical information that has been leaked, but there's no mandatory reporting back to them should it happen within their supply chain, which is really critical. I think the other thing is a large number of the respondents, over 75%, said that they have competing priorities within their resources. They don't have a person who's nominated to manage this, and then insufficient data or a shortage of experience to tackle how they address these risks in their supply chain.
Is this, Matt, a journey that they're going on? So it sounds like it's improving, but there's still a long way to go, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's right. Cyber risk being the number one risk, and it was in the survey, the number one risk within the top 5 risks that were identified by the respondents. 68% had cyber up there. I do know from our experience, many organisations have cyber as number one risk these days. But I think when you look at it more broadly, cyber is just one aspect of security within an organisation, and where state-based actors or other organised criminals or cyber criminals seek to access. We've seen the uplift in cyber resilience programs, but there is now an emerging understanding of the broader security defences that need to be put in place, and it's slowly being uptaken.
Sarah, bringing you into this, when I read the report, the one risk which I suppose I hadn't thought a lot about was insider risk. What is it? And is it considered is it a human problem?
Yeah, interesting, Sean. I don't think you're the only one that thinks that way. I think, as we were saying, I think there's pretty now widespread acceptance from organisations that know it's a matter of when and not if when it comes to cyber attacks within their business. And if we use that analogy of a house, we know we've got to lock the doors, we know we've got to change the locks regularly, and we've got to put the alarms on. But what is just as important is considering the threat that's posed by your people within your business, the ones you've actually got to give those house keys to. Those people are the ones that they know your systems, they know your weaknesses, they know your vulnerabilities, and they also know the value, that real value that lies in your assets. The difficulty in really managing that insider risk is that you've got to give the keys to somebody, which makes it so crucial for organisations to ensure that they provide the access, the information and the control to the right people, which can be a real challenge for organisations. The other thing I think that ties it in and why it is such a human problem. At the end of the day, we've got people at the end of keyboards and they're your insiders. The motivations of those insiders can be pretty difficult and complex to spot. The threat, it can be a malicious attack, a self-motivated attack, or in some cases we also see where it involves coercion with an outsider and a reliance on an outsider. So as such, it being such a human problem, there's that real need to understand that psychological and situational factors that may drive an employee to become an insider risk threat. And I think also as we talk to, I think the environment that we're in at the moment and that link to insider risk, we've certainly seen a pretty volatile employment market in the last few years. The Great Resignation, quietly quitting and all these other things. And now I think as we're moving through this cycle of pretty tough economic conditions, we've seen significant restructures and redundancies across industries. I think with that volatility, there is that greater risk of these insider threats coming to the fore. We are certainly seeing them and working with some clients around the challenge that they present. And I think also just reflecting on my experience, I've worked in this space of sort of financial crime forensic for a long time and working in those matters that involve trusted insiders. What we see time and time again is that when people are under any form of pressure, they do unusual and strange things.
Stay with me, Matt and Sarah. We'll be back in a minute. I'm talking to Matt Feehan and Sarah Deedy from McGrath-Nicol. The survey says that 87% of surveyed executives were confident their business had a comprehensive insider risk management program in place. Fine. However, less than a third actually implemented fundamental insider risk controls. How do you do that? What are the basic controls that you should be implementing?
Yeah, it's interesting, Sean, and they were pretty interesting results from the survey. I mean, I think more broadly, we're certainly seeing an increased focus on insider risks. We personally, McGrath-Nicol, have partnered with the Australian Insider Risk Centre of Excellence, and there's some really important work going on more broadly around education and awareness of these risks. From that regulatory perspective, the amendments to the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act now demand that owners of critical infrastructure assets identify those critical workers, assess their suitability and the level of risk they pose. So I think the awareness piece is there, which I think is where you see that 87% figure come through. But in a sense, as you said, Sean, we've got organisations that are confident they have in place a comprehensive program. And yet when we start to dig beneath the surface of that and start to explore what controls organisations have in place to actually mitigate the threats, we can see that some of those human-centric controls are being overlooked. At the end of the day, as we've said, we're talking about humans. So whilst technology is such a key part of this issue, at the center of every attack is a person. And so as a result, you've really got to come at it with those human-based controls in place. A couple of key ones that sort of stand out for us: risk-based due diligence is really fundamental for critical roles. Do you know who it is that you're doing business with? Do you know what information and access those key people in key roles have? And the survey really highlighted that only 20% of organizations actually have that risk-based due diligence in place for key roles. Another one, which again ties into that human piece, is training and awareness. Again, results out of the survey showed that only 27% have an insider education and awareness program in place. And I think it's important to note that this is part of a broader framework and program. So a truly effective insider program really does incorporate all functions of an organisation. And I think that's a real challenge for some organisations, particularly in that small and medium enterprise space, because the risk area is broad. There's that real need to understand who should own it and how should resources be prioritised. And there's that real need for organisations to have those critical conversations around how to manage this risk.
Okay, Matt, at the very top, you talked about geopolitics and geopolitical risk. Should business leaders be worried about the upcoming US election? What happens if a second Trump administration is voted in?
Sean, I think from a geopolitical perspective and US politics, many organisations, large, medium or small, do reflect on what impact, if any, I think many think it would have on their operations. Trump's already indicated that he would impose tariffs on certain imports, and I think that's alarming to some. But I think the way we look at it is, under your risk management and a risk management framework, are you assessing the possibility of disruption in your supply chain? So those tariffs and looking at what does that mean to the trade flows or the flows of cargo and disruption to your supply chain? What are the consequential impacts? What are there any retaliatory steps that other nations may take, and therefore does that pose a risk in as far as, say, sanctions that may emerge? So I think what may be predictable, or in many cases a little unpredictable from a new Trump office, I think it's running scenarios, which is what we suggest to clients. But the geopolitical risks, when you look at that by itself, a Trump administration, we've also got broader issues such as what we've seen over the last week with Israel and Hamas now conflict escalating, and how that may disrupt supply chain, let alone if there is any disruption within our region. I think it's more important that organisations consider what may impact their business and take appropriate steps to run the scenarios and understand how they would respond or what they need to do within their supply chain, but more importantly from a security perspective.
Okay. Sarah, there is positive news out of it, the survey. Most enterprise risk management programs now include supply chain risk as a core pillar. That's good news. What leads me to ask, will attacks on critical infrastructure and critical supply chains become more common, do you think?
I don't think there's any doubt. We continue to see these attacks increase in both number and severity. Sean, I think we're seeing it more broadly across all sectors and industries year on year. These attacks continue to come our way, both domestically and also internationally as well. In answering that, I think we really have to remember where these attacks are coming from. We're talking about incredibly well-resourced and sophisticated threat actors, whether their motivations are financial, if we're talking about a ransom, or whether it's just to disrupt. These are big and lucrative enterprises. I think if we're talking about infrastructure and critical supply chain specifically, whether we're talking about attacks from nation states or just well-resourced cyber criminal groups, these groups and organisations are intent on causing disruption and accessing information when we're talking about critical infrastructure, whether that be for now and sort of immediate attacks, or whether it's to serve their best purposes at a point in time that they choose to sort of, launch these attacks. I think when we talk about critical infrastructure entities and the supply chains that resource them, they hold significant valuable knowledge and data. And it is that knowledge and information that these actors are intent on either disrupting, learning from, or even stealing. And I think that's why we're going to continue to see both nation states and cyber criminals continue to breach critical infrastructure and those critical supply chains that support them. At the end of the day, I think when it comes to these, there's a lot at stake for both the attacked and also the attackers as well.
Matt, there is legislation coming in around this, the security of critical infrastructure legislation. It requires critical infrastructure assets and organisations to have and submit a risk management program, plenty of detail in that. It includes things like protections against supply chain issues, cyber attacks, insider risk. The deadline's fast approaching. It's the end of next month. Applies to certain businesses operating across different sectors. Matt, how prepared do you think Australian organisations are for this? And if they're not prepared now, what should they be doing?
Thanks, Sean. I think when the legislation came in 2022, certainly the reporting deadline now to understand what they've got in place by way of a risk management program, critical infrastructure risk management program, that first reporting date on the 28th of September is fast approaching, probably fast approaching for a number of organisations. I think from our experience, it's clear those that are resourced have responded or are responding and being prepared to report, but many organisations at various sizes are not yet ready. I think we're going to see a range of organisations really try and rush to meet the deadline as it approaches. But as with many of these new pieces of reporting requirements, it's probably going to be unfortunate where we're going to see enforcement or a number of organisations held to account. And once that's made public, I think we start to see others then react when they see either penalty or some form of discipline imposed on an organisation, if I put it that way. I think that the key for directors to understand and management is really this could be your license to operate, and your supply chain, your counterparties will be inquiring as to what you have in place, and the government expects that is there. So it will be plausible for an organisation to ask what you have in place. Equally, if it's then publicised that you have not met the reporting requirements, that's where I think there becomes a real issue around your continuity of, or your ability to continue to engage with certain counterparties, be they government, some of the high risk or prime contractors. It can be a significant reputational piece if you don't get it organised. And I think that's where management need to ensure that they're putting appropriate time and resources to ensuring that they're able to meet the deadline as it approaches on the 28th of September.
I suppose just very quickly, Matt, most organisations who need to meet this reporting deadline, they're fully aware that they need to do it?
It's a really good question, because most organisations should be aware. And really where I hear surprises from organisations, it's where they think they should be covered, but when they actually do look into it, they aren't.
Right.
They aren't obliged to comply, and they were surprised by that. So yes, organisations need to understand. I would like to think that most are fully aware of the security of critical infrastructure legislation. Now it's 2 years in, and have been focused on the reporting guidelines. But, I think it needs immediate action, with us now about a month out from that reporting date.
Matt, Sarah, thank you both for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
That was McGrath-Nicol Partner and Head of Advisory, Matt Feehan AM, and Partner Forensic, Sarah Deedy. McGrath-Nicol is a great supporter of this podcast. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.